Welcome back to Dr. Supercoach YouTube. You're on with Pig, and I'm continuing my pre-season series in which I get to sit down and chat with some of my favourite Supercoach content creators. Today, I'm joined by the stat man, the mathemagician, Jaden. Welcome to the podcast, Jaden.
Hey Pig, yeah, great to be on, and yeah, pretty good compliment there. That's what I'm trying to do. So hopefully we can get some value out of it today.
Absolutely, I think that's definitely what you're known in the community for, the data crunching and going beyond what a lot of normal casuals would do. So one of the things, when we were chatting to you beforehand, one of the things you really wanted to chat about that you've been digging into a bit is the 3300 rule. There are some people, I guess, out there that don't know what the 3300 rule is. So first, do you want to explain what that is, and then what your research has found? If you think there's any way that we can, use that to help us in selecting players or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the most underrated aspects of the Supercoach scoring system in general, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that people know the rule, being every single game in Supercoach is worth 3,300 total points. So every player gets brought up or brought down so that it all adds up in the end to the 3,300. But the issue is we follow along with live scoring, and it gets done during the game. So you don't actually notice it's happening. It's just ticking along in the background. It'll bring up players as they need to, bring them down. But if you're watching live scoring, you have no idea how much of a big effect it has. So what I did was basically this time last year, I came up with a fairly good model for how Supercoach scored. And if you sub in like all the stat values, what you think they're worth and stuff, then you can get an idea of what players are scoring before the scaling happens. So if I don't apply the 3,300 rule at all, you get a pretty good understanding of which teams are getting the most scaling and which aren't. And this is one of the key differences between Supercoach and fantasy scoring, because in fantasy we can have teams that score really well, score a lot of points, but then they also let the opposition score really well. So both teams, like, it's kick to kick. But in Supercoach, if that game happens, it's still worth 3,300. And then you'll have teams like Port Adelaide where they're really restrictive over the past few years in fantasy. But they don't really have that many good scorers in fantasy either. So they need to get brought up as well. And something I found pretty interesting about the 3,300 rule last year was West Coast in particular and Port Adelaide. Since 2021, they got the most scaling out of any team in a positive direction. So West Coast really only scored 1,400 points per game themselves, which is really, really low.
Yeah.
Not much of the pie, as people like to call it. And the opposition, yeah, they can flog them. They can do really well. But the issue is the opposition can only do so much. There's only so many points they can get. So at the end of the day, the West Coast games really only had 3,200 points in them compared to the 3,300 that we need. So during the game, all the scores are getting brought up. So we saw really good averages from Jeremy McGovern and even Elliot Yeo at times. Just because like they might only be averaging 107 in real life, but with the scaling applied, it's a 110 average. So it ends up being a very big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe in different ways, like you're saying, Port and West Coast being two of the ones that often get scaled up. Port because they're good, and West Coast because they were bad, in a way. So I guess it helps them both ways. But what about Port then, for example? If they're restricting teams, does that mean that, someone like Butters or Houston last year gets just a boost that other teams might not get? Is that how you view it?
Yeah, definitely. So Zach Butters is a really good example because over in fantasy, he doesn't have the best scoring. And a lot of that does come from the fact that in Supercoach, he gets boosted in the 3,300 rule where Port are really only having 3,200 points per game. So the very best players on that team are getting the most scaling. So it works on a percentage type thing. So a player averaging 100 would get double the amount of scaling that a 50 player would be getting. So that's why we have these premiums like Butters and Houston in the past that have gone really well in Supercoach, and not so much over in fantasy, but yeah, mainly in Supercoach. Zach Butters is an interesting one because last year he got around 2.5 points, 3 points per game just from that scaling, which is quite a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like. Is there any teams that go the other way? That kind of them and their opponents generally score over 3,300 and then have to be brought down?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's all on the same kind of scale. The kind of issue with my model is that it is centered around 3,300 because we only get the scores at the end. Like we don't get the scores before they're scaled. But the interesting thing is, and that we've noticed, is like disposals across the league are like diminishing. Fantasy scoring's diminishing. So technically Supercoach scoring is diminishing as well, but you don't notice it because all the scores get brought up at the end. So last year there was only 4 teams that, according to my model, went over 3,300, and this is centered on the last 4 years. So scoring is going down, which is good for our premiums because if there's less points around, the top players get brought up even more. So if you've ever watched a game of AFLW and seen the Supercoach scores down the bottom, you'll know that the best players score like 200, which is not surprising because if it's really low scoring, then they get a lot of scaling. So that's kind of where we're at. Essendon and St Kilda were the 2 last year that were very brought down. So mainly due to the fact that they score a lot themselves by their back half play and transition ball, very effective. But then they also don't really restrict. So like defenders versus St Kilda is a very old known thing. So we're all streaming them there basically because they don't restrict either. So it's a bit of a kick-to-kick play, but it all gets brought down at the end. So yeah, there's some interesting players that have some interesting scaling going on there.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I think it is, like you said, people know that the 3,300 rule exists, but they don't really understand how it works, or especially like you said about the in-game stuff. Like we'll be watching along and, our player kicks a goal and we instantly look at it and we're like, oh, why was that only worth 5 points? Or another time you'll be like, well, that was worth 15 points. Like it doesn't seem consistent, but it is, and there's a model behind it. It's just that it's not, it's not instant, it's not super live, but also the fact that there's scaling going on in match, I think people really need to understand.
Yeah, 100%. And most of that scaling does get done in game. Like people will talk about like the instant the siren goes, they'll say, okay, my players scored 110, but this is before scaling. Scaling's already been happening the whole game. They just need to double check at the end that it's ended up lining up. So you could say, oh, it's half time, we've given out half the points, but then that might not add up at the end. So they do a very good job of making it very close at the end. And what that means is if you're watching along live, you see the final siren, your player's on 110, and then they get bumped up to 111. You say, oh, well, that was the scaling. Not much really happened. It's not really that big of a deal. But some of these players are getting like a seasonal average of 4 points just from the 3,300 rule. So that this could be a player that's gone from 110 average and they've gone down to 105 in the real scoring. But then because their team has changed a lot over the year, they're still averaging 110. And you don't notice the difference at all. But they could have had a poorer season.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I guess one of my main takeaways is that if you're picking a premium in a bad team, they are actually probably getting a scaling boost because there aren't that many people taking points off them. A bit like Brownlow, there aren't many people stealing votes, but there aren't as many people stealing points. And maybe that's why McGovern and Yo types just ballooned and had great years last year because there weren't many other West Coast guys stealing it. And even Butters to an extent, like the lower end of Port aren't racking up the points.
Yeah, so I'll just reel off some of the names just so people have a bit of an idea. So Elliot Yeo was the most scaled player last year, just based on the games that he played and whether the opposition had an effect on that. So his real average was 101, but his true average was 105. So there's a 4-point swing right there.
Yeah.
If Elliot Yeo was playing on like a standard team across the comp, his average would be 101. But just from playing for the Eagles alone, that's a 105 average.
Yeah.
Zach Butters was next, average 117, but his true average was 120 and a half. So that's a pretty big boost. If he could play exactly the same this year and average 120, like actually better than last year because he's increased his average from the 117 to a 120, but Port could get a lot better. Better from a scoring point of view where they maybe hold the ball a bit more. And Butters ends up averaging 120 again. and even though he's had a much better year. So yeah, and then I guess at the other end of things, Essendon copped it a bit. So Zach Merritt, for example, his average was 116, but his real average was only 115. So as I said before, there's a few reasons for that being a lot less down the bottom end because of previous years. But yeah, it can have a pretty big swing, especially for players that change teams, because you consider being on a team where you're getting 4 points of scaling, and then you go to another team, you do the exact same thing, and you're averaging 5 points less, which is pretty crazy.
Dan Houston, maybe.
Yeah, he was one on my radar, but funnily enough, when I did do the research, Collingwood was actually third for the most scaling last year.
He might be fine.
Yeah, so he'll be fine to keep his little boost there. Yeah, I think it's quite a fascinating part of it. Like, people will focus on the fact that SuperCoach has the margin and stuff like that involved. This is something completely different, where it's just all games have to equal the same. Like you said with the Brownlow, if West Coast continue to be very poor from a scoring point of view, the opposition can only do so much. They could continue to get this good scaling coming up in 2025.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think they will be. Maybe Richmond as well, especially if they've lost 6 of their premiership players, and the rookies that they're replacing them with score less. Maybe it means that their actual premiums, like the Nank or the Taranto, whoever, maybe get a little boost potentially. Remains 16.
And one more thing on this, I think people do tend to think about the SuperCoach pie as a 2-team-sided type of thing. So they'll go, Richmond are getting flogged, Richmond are going to get no points, they're going to get no portion of the SuperCoach pie, which is generally true, but with the 3,300 rule, all players get considered in the same boat. So they all get brought up. If you're averaging 110 on a team that's smashing it versus 110 on a team that's got flogged, you'll still get scaled up the same amount if you're in the same game. Yeah. And it can vary a lot across different games, but it's important to remember, just because your team got flogged doesn't mean you get less 3,300 point rule than the other team who flogged you.
Yeah, no, that is good to know, because I wouldn't have been sure about that either. One of the things that also I wanted to chat to you about as we go through this is, and you've done a bit of work on this before, and I'll call it regression to the mean, but either from a team perspective, especially like a team that's really high, has really high amount of stoppages, or a team that has really low amount of stoppages, either way, but then that changing from year to year, and how we can look at that, I guess, the team style and the team game plan and how it can affect players. Like, for instance, I looked at, in 2023, Bulldogs were the second highest stoppage team in the league, and I know you talked about it that off-season, that is that sustainable, and it wasn't really. In 2024, they regressed to near league average in stoppages. Bont's English dropped, English's average dropped. English, I think there might be a few other factors at play here, but as well, like Sam Darcy chopping out. But that kind of, maybe the unsustainable high stoppage rates regressing just back to kind of league average. Do you think that's probably potentially a reason for Bont? He only dropped 3 points per game last year, but would you consider that as a factor?
Yeah, absolutely. I think English is the best example, as you mentioned. Like, people will talk about a lot of different things, and that is true. There are a lot of factors that come into it. Like, people will talk about the ruck rule and whatever else they can throw in, but it could be just a bit of over-engineering. Like, we're looking at a team that were the number 1 or equal number 1 in stoppages in 2023, and that's 10 or 12 stoppages above the league average. So they did end up coming back by 5 stoppages a game. And if you look at English in terms of his ruck numbers, you can look at Sam Darcy taking a higher percentage. But to be honest, English actually took the same amount. It's just the whole Bulldogs team had less stoppages, so the percentage seems less, but it's actually because of the Bulldogs coming down. English comes down in line with that. So Sam Darcy is a factor, but I like to think of it more as the Dogs came down, which makes the percentage look worse, even though English did exactly the same. And yeah, the Dogs are an interesting case as well, because you said that Bont went down by 2 or 3 points last year, which is pretty crazy, because we've just talked about the 3,300 rule, and For all the Dogs to score really well in 2023, they got scaled down a lot, like the most out of anything I've seen in my data set. So Bont in 2023, with this high stoppage team, he actually averaged 134. So if he was playing on an average team, he would have averaged 134, which is, I think, pretty crazy. Libra and English were also in the top 3 that year. But just because they played for the Bulldogs, they're losing a lot of points. Like Bont's losing 4 points a game just because the rest of his teammates are dominating as well. From a stoppage point of view, lots of tackles, contested possessions. So Bont's real drop-off was actually 7.5 points last year. But we get masked by that because the Dogs went from being the most scaled-down team to just right on league average. So there was a big drop-off there from the Dogs in general for scoring. And so while we see the big drop-off for English's scoring, Bont's was there. It's just masked a bit.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy if he was going 134 and then essentially being dragged down by how good his teammates were. I mean, sounds a bit harsh, but also probably why he hasn't won a Brownlow at the moment, because his teammates are also stealing some of his Brownlow votes if you compare it that way. I look at like 2024, the higher stoppage teams, and see like, is there anyone there that I'm worried about dropping off? I look at like Geelong, Brisbane, Adelaide are kind of the top 3 of last year, but they're also really up there in 2023, so maybe that's just who they are. Don't know, or if we look at it the other way, I guess is a good thing, like Richmond with this Dimmer Hardwick style of ball of just knock it on and don't take possession. They've always been a pretty low stoppage team, but last year they were the worst in the league. There's an interesting discussion around, and they were bad by a lot. They were like 8 stoppages per game less than league average. So with a new coach and maybe being really bad and having to play a bit more possession footy, maybe, that's just speculating. Could someone like a Richmond or even a St Kilda or Melbourne, who are the next 2 worst stoppage teams, not worse, but the fewest amount of stoppages, if those kind of teams regress to the mean, I guess we could see a bump in some of those guys, like their ruckman or their premium mids. Are there any of those 3 teams that you'd potentially look at that could get a little boost just from actually becoming average?
Yeah, I think St Kilda is a pretty good candidate for moving up, just from based on what's happened in the past decade or so. If I spit all those numbers together in a true data analysis form, we can kind of get an estimate of what they could realistically do from a stoppage point of view. So if you look at Geelong, who's right at the top with 104 stoppages per game, just similar to the Dogs from the year before, we'd really only expect them to potentially have 98 in the upcoming year. Like, realistically, we're not going to come out and say they're going to do 104 again. We're going to bring them back towards the league average a bit and say, based on everything that's happened in the last decade, they're probably going to end up around the 98 range, which is still best in the comp because everyone's getting brought down. So you pretty much need to halve the gap between how far away they are from league average and then what they actually did. So you can bring that down by half and say, this is probably a more realistic expectation for what they could do. St Kilda had a very good end to the year, and I'm expecting them to move up a bit in the stoppages, which I think is pretty good for players like Jack McRae, to just get more stoppages around it. But yeah, it's hard to know with this type of stuff what will happen, and I would recommend that you do your pre-season research. I know Richmond have sprinkled in a little bit of an idea of trying to be more defensive and more contested around the ball. It's only very light conversations, but that's a much better thing to do, like research into what clubs are saying compared to trying to base it off last year or even a prediction like I'm doing here.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things that go into it. I'm just telling you that it's not very predictable. Like, if you're looking at last year and go, there were so many teams that did 100 stoppages per game, we should see that again. It's just not massively likely to predict anyone to go 100. You're just going to wait and have to see.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I guess some people could try and look into the coaching, like Ross the Boss at St Kilda, is that just what he is? Does he just want to play that like low stoppage one, or does he actually want higher? You know, like you said, maybe Richmond come out and say we'll be a bit more defensive and not like we won't just smash it on at all costs like Dimmer did. If you hear things like that, maybe you go, maybe Toby Nankervis is going to get a lot more stoppages and ruck contests to attend. Maybe that's a little bit of something. I mean, there's even a narrative with Melbourne that they're going to be better, hopefully, this year in the midfield with Gawn, Petrarca, Oliver and Viney all healthy. So it just won't slingshot out of there as much and they might get repeat stoppages. That could be a narrative, but like you said, we're just kind of speculating and people need to do a bit of research and listen to what the game plan's going to be to try and predict that, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I do like all of those examples. It's just important to keep in mind, like when you're coming up for an expectation of how many stoppages a team might have, just like bring it back towards league average a bit. Like we won't see the same teams at the top, the same teams at the bottom, unless they're Richmond, because over the last, 6-7 years, Richmond have been really bad for scoring points at stoppages, like so bad that they're like, so you imagine all the teams and then there's league average and then there's the 17th ranked team. Richmond are like another level away. So like if you measure the gap from the average to 17th, Richmond are that far away from 17th. They've just never scored well at stoppages. Interestingly enough, the 2 years that they like were comparable to another team was 2017 and 2023. And they were both the years where they actually had a midfielder go actually all right in terms of scoring. So from a Tim Taranto point of view, I'm hoping that Richmond can actually, be on a similar level to at least the team in 17th for scoring points at stoppages. So, and Tim Taranto should do a lot there. So hopefully from him bouncing back point of view, that's where they end up.
Yeah, so are there any kind of outlier trends, whether it's these stoppage ones or like there's kick-in data available as well, and for some reason Bulldogs had like the least kick-ins out of any team for the year, just random outliers like that. I remember last year you talked about there was one team that just weren't playing on from kick-ins much. I think it might have been Brisbane or somewhere like that. Like you just go, that's weird. Are there any kind of weird outlier ones that you could potentially see regressing towards a mean, or do you think it's just too hard to predict?
I think there are some things that you can keep in mind more from a like regression point of view, and regression goes both ways. Yeah. Like we always talk about regression as such a negative thing, but it does go both ways of like you could have a really bad year and then you're just going to go back to what you should probably be expected to do. Clayton Oliver's a good example of that. Like we know what he can do. He's just had this bad year, so we'd probably expect him to get closer back to what he's normally done. Not really expecting
regress to 110.
Yeah, so it goes both ways. That's what it means. But
yeah,
in the Supercoach and fantasy world, we talk about it as such a negative thing. I guess from a player point of view, there's two that I'm pretty interested in. From a defensive kicking point of view, it's Luke Ryan and it's Lockie Whitfield. Yep. Last year they scored a lot of points from kick-ins in particular. Like over in fantasy, Whitfield did 30.2 points from kick-ins alone, like
per game.
So what he would not from taking the kick-in itself, but from the process of the kick-in. So here's what he'd do: he'd go to the square, he'd kick it to someone in the back pocket, and then he'd run around him for a handball, and then he'd get another kick. Exactly, So he's really junking it up in the back half there. That's 30 points, and that's more than I've ever found from any other player before. So I'm not really expecting that to continue. And the main reason for that is last year the Giants were very lucky in terms of that opposition missing. If you want a good example of this, go and watch the Gold Coast game where they kicked about 20 behinds. So, yeah, they were very lucky last year based on where the players were taking their shots from. And there was a lot more behinds than we expected. So, yeah, I'm expecting Lockie Whitfield to miss out on a bit of that this year, just from a, like, you can't really expect that to happen again. It can, but it's unlikely. And Luke,
an outlier.
Yeah, exactly. And Luke Ryan as well. He did about 67 points last year just from his disposals. And the reason why is in Supercoach you get rewarded for effective disposals, long disposals, but most importantly, you get a 20% boost for everything you do in defensive 50. And I'm not sure if many people know that. That's why the defenders go okay, especially the ones that never leave defensive 50, where he's a very good sweeper and doesn't miss his kicks really. So he's got the dream Supercoach role. But yeah, 67 points just from his disposals alone was like the most that I've got on record. So I think that's pretty easy to pass in terms of going, don't really want to start him in my team, and that's fair enough. There's a lot of other team factors going on as well, but just from that point of view, that goes into his price, and it means he's very highly priced, and you're expecting him to have another record year? Probably not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good way of looking at it. Of you just look at the data. If there's any crazy outliers that are either have never happened before, or if they do it, it doesn't happen 2 or 3 times in a row. You just think, is that really sustainable? And I haven't really crunched the numbers on it yet. I'll be planning to soon. But one that jumps out to me was Tristan Cherry's tackle numbers were just off the charts and one of the biggest things we've ever seen for ruckman. Like, maybe he could do that again, but would you be smart to bet on it happening again when it hasn't really happened like that before?
Yeah, it's kind of hard because the rucks are all falling over themselves at the moment, so he might actually run out of options. Like, He's actually one that I ruled out pretty quickly from my own team. Like, I just want to spend my time focusing on the other rucks. But, yeah, they're all falling over, so I might be forced to take it. And, yeah, basically, I do only have the fantasy numbers on hand, but he was doing 80-something point, 85, I think, from stoppages last year. And that's more than any other player has done this decade by over 10 points. So That's 10 points better than what Nank did in 2023. It was genuinely crazy what he was doing. And the fixture was there. Like, he absolutely made the most of the fixture, which isn't his fault. Like, it's good to see him dominate it.
Yeah.
I think I'm potentially just going to wait around. I don't know. I could be forced to pick him, especially with 3 rucks this year, or I'm hoping to pick 3 rucks. I could be forced to pick him, but yeah, I wouldn't expect it to continue. I think he could still go, close enough to the top 2 though. But yeah, I'll just have a few more concerns around North and like whether they want to, be more aggressive at stoppages. I know they've been practicing that a lot, just from getting it out of there instead of just tackle instantly.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good example, and Cherry's probably someone that if owners are starting him, they probably shouldn't be expecting that big. I don't think they would be. I don't think they'd be expecting that big streak of 140 games in a row, but I think some people are still expecting him to go like 115 and 1 to 120, and I think that's probably asking a fair bit too much in terms of keeping up what he was doing, especially with that. He does have a very tough early run apart from round 1 against English. Like, he's got a really nice run actually after his bye, so maybe he goes on a little 120 run there, we'll see. But in terms of such an outlier of scoring such insane numbers at stoppage, I think, like you said, 10 more than any player has ever done. You kind of look at that and you just go, how could that maintain? It's not really possible.
Yeah, so that's where I sit at the moment. I could be forced to pick him, and like, I guess the case for picking him is he can go big. Like, that's the main thing. Like, in the right matchup, like, he had everything line up last year, which he made the most of. So credit to him for that. And to be honest, if there's one stat where you're like, I want my player to be good at it, I think it's probably tackles.
Yep.
Like, you can pretty well continue that, especially like on a team where there aren't really a lot of other ruck options. Like, he's generally pretty reliable, and you'd hope that he continue it. The issue is, like, if you're too good at one thing, then you probably just won't do it again. And that's what we saw with English, because he scored so much around the ground and not from doing ruck stuff. So that was always going to come down, which was a pretty big reason why he went down from his big average in 2023.
Yeah. No, and I don't think we're saying that Cherry's going to be a bad pick at all, and we're just saying temper the expectations that no one could probably keep that up for too long.
Yeah.
So now moving on, which player, this is a question from our SuperCoach Slack community, which player would you really love to start, but maybe you don't have the guts to, or a bit wary of, or something like that? Someone you think would be really fun, but you're not sure if you'll go there.
Yeah, there's a few that come to mind. I think one that I've been looking at more in detail is Jack Graham for the reasons that I talked about earlier. So the forward line's obviously, one of the worst we've ever seen. I think technically worse than last year based on the overall average of the forwards. So I'm looking for some players there, and I think just there's a few things that go his way, like the West Coast midfield is falling over, and he's never actually really had the chance to, I guess, get in there and have a real crack at midfield. Like you could say, oh, well, when he was at Richmond, he wasn't really doing it. If you pull up his centre bounce numbers from before that online for everyone to view, he was really only doing 30% at most. So if he's probably going to have a career best year if he gets the 60% that he will probably get based on all the injuries they have. And sure, he's a defensive midfielder, but I'm hoping for forward status it'll be enough. I'm just a little bit wary because he hasn't massively got any runs on the board, but with the right role, I'd rather pick something like that than a player who could naturally improve. So I do like him as an option, and I think if West Coast continue to score not many points, he could benefit from the 3,300 rule. So he's someone that I want to pick, but he hasn't actually made it into my team yet. I'm just a bit scared.
And then he's also someone with, I guess, the injury history of what he does that adds a little element. But I think that's an awesome answer. I haven't heard him discuss much, and I feel like you paint a pretty good picture for why maybe we should consider him at least a bit. Would you think Liam Baker potentially is someone that could be, get a boost from playing in an average team as well?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the 3,300 stuff isn't massively important because they came from Richmond.
Yeah.
Came from Richmond, who were fourth or something last year for the most. But yeah, I think Baker's another interesting one. I'll just pull up what he mainly did last year. So he's pretty versatile. He had a lot of clangers though last year. I'm not sure if that's kind of Richmond's fault. So he was about 10th or 12th in the comp last year for losing points from clangers. Richmond were pretty bad, but that's something I'm a little bit wary of. Hopefully when he gets to half back, it frees him up to have more options with his disposal. But yeah, that's something I'm a little bit hesitant on. And he did go pretty well last year, overall with an 82 average. So it is a bit more expensive than a lot of the other options we're looking for in the forward line at the moment.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So then if we now move on to, we're going to both bring a player to the table, someone that we want to have a chat about and a discussion. We've both done a bit of research on, we'll both get each other's thoughts on it. Do you want to bring someone to the table first?
Yeah, I can.
Who's your player?
I'll start right at the top, I guess.
Okay.
I'll start with Bont.
Yeah.
And I just want to talk about how he kind of is so good in SuperCoach and why we can rely on him so well. From a midfield point of view, the last 2 years or 3 years, 2 years. Sorry, he's just been dominating the top. Like I said earlier, the 134 average would have been ridiculous if he was on another team. Or imagine if he was on the West Coast and he would have averaged 140. But he just does so many different things, which is why his SuperCoach scoring is so good. So last year he did 45 points from possession, contested stuff. His disposals were 37 points. And he impressively also did 17 of his points from tackling. And he does get around the ground for those. So it's pretty important if you can get into forward 50 and get some of those. It's worth 20% more. So that's where he gets some of that. Most importantly, his clangers are quite low as well, compared to how much ball he gets. But the real one that sets him apart from all the other mids, and he's done this 2 years in a row, is just the 1%ers that he gets. So last year he averaged he averaged 11.7 points from 1%ers, and that's more than any other midfielder had, by a long way, because double. So the next best mid that really played most of the year was Josh Dunkley, who did 4.7 points from 1%ers.
That's a huge difference.
So, like, if you look at his stats overall compared to a lot of the other mids, and this is why in fantasy he's more level with all the other mids, he does very similar in the possession, very similar in the disposal, tackling's good, marking's good, and he hits the scoreboard more than others. But the one thing that sets him apart and gets him that extra 5-10 points compared to other mids is the 1%ers, and a lot of that comes from the contested knock-ons that he does.
Yep.
It's basically the Bont stat, I think Champion Data have made, not made, it's always been a thing.
Yeah.
It's just Bont's made the most of it, really. So he's doing a lot of points from that, which sets him apart from the rest. And I think like he's someone that you can look to pick with confidence in 2025. I mentioned that the Dogs struggled a lot with scaling in 2023 because they're all going so well.
Yeah.
Bont did regress back like 7 points, but he didn't really get 3,300 at all. So he did about the 127. I'm still comfortable enough to pick him, mainly due to the Dogs having a lot of injury issues. So if he has to carry the team again, and a lot of the other good scorers out of that team are gone, like even Liam Jones last year, he did a lot of points from contested intercept marks in the back line. Treloar's gone for the first portion of the year. I'm still pretty confident that, like, even if he does a little bit less, maybe the Dogs overall can get a bit more scaling, a bit more favourably. And as long as he keeps up the 1%ers that set him apart from the rest, like, I think he's still a good option overall.
Yeah, and I think his consistency, like he's been the only player in SuperCoach that hasn't dropped below 600k in either of the last 2 years. So you've never been able to get him under 600k the last 2 years. He got pretty close last year, but didn't quite get there. And we know his high ceiling. We know he's got a pretty great floor as well. Something I noticed with him last year is his kick to handball ratio changed a lot, like deteriorated. He was much more of a kicker in 2023, and it was kind of, he was handballing, like he lost a couple of kicks per game and gained a couple of handballs per game last year, which is interesting. Maybe it was just, Treloar or someone instead of Libba. So like in 2023, Libba was probably feeding it to him, whereas maybe it swapped and he was feeding it to Treloar or something like that. But it didn't really make a huge difference. He's still there. He's still like the best player in the game. His CBA's dipped a little bit. Like he was at 81% in 2023, and then he went down to 75%. But I wouldn't be too worried about that, like you said, especially with Treloar going out. I think it's going to be Bont and Richards being 1 and 2, and probably Bont being the main one of them. So yeah, I know we often, talk about starting people at 700k, which Bont essentially is 700k if you factor in the price changes that have been done for the flex position. We often talk about starting those guys at 700k is actually the biggest risk, because if they kind of do an English of last year and drop 150k, that screws you over even more than a Jordan Dawson. Well, Jordan Dawson was expensive, that's a bad example, but even it's worse than starting someone at 500k and then them just stagnating. So are you is Bont, do you think, the exception to that, starting someone at that 700k-ish? Just because he's so consistent, or is it still a big risk?
Yeah, like, it is a risk, and like, it doesn't mean I'm locked in on him, just from the price point of view, and like, there is so much extra value that we can look for this year, and yeah, I guess the one thing is mainly just the injuries that are around him. Like, I'm just hoping that he can do well enough, and even if like he falls back a bit, but the team struggles, he can still average the same overall. And yeah, you're right about the kind of the like kicking and handballing and stuff. So like I said, like he had a big drop off last year. We just didn't get to see it because the Dogs lost all that 3,300 penalisation. So last year, like his big drop off came in tackles mainly, which you could say is from the stoppage stuff, which is fine. Like, we're not expecting them really to go best in the comp again. Like, we don't massively need it. But now we know that Bont can average 125 when things maybe aren't exactly perfect. Like, we looked at his average in 2023, like his real average of 129, 130, and it's like, that's really high. His real average was 134 before the scaling stuff. So, like, last year wasn't his best year, and he still went 125. So, like, I'm a bit scared to not consider him, especially with the drop-off that he had. So most of it came from the tackling, and then, the disposals, as you mentioned, like, kicking versus handballing in SuperCoach is, like, a big difference. Like, you're only getting 1 point per handball, really, on a good day, but your kicking can really set you apart. So, I'm okay with picking him at the moment, because, like, the difference between, like, him this year and someone like English last year is, you're looking at English, who's coming off a career year. Like, Bont's already had his career year, and his second best is, like, this 125. So I'm hoping he can repeat that again. Like, he doesn't have to do massively anything amazing, because he's so balanced, which is my main point of presenting him today.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely true. Those guys that score in all areas just are so consistent, and it was nearly the inverse of what you said when we're a little bit worried about Cherry. He scores so well in, like, one particular area that if that dropped off, we're a little worried, whereas Bont's so consistent. So now the guy I'm going to bring to the table to discuss with you is Jaden Short, someone that I'm interested in but also wrestling with, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, because 4 years in a row, Jaden Short averaged around 98 SuperCoach. He was just solid, really good, did his job. Then last year he dropped off to an 82 average. His disposal efficiency stayed similar. His marks and kicks went down a bit. Time on ground down a bit. It's I don't really know what happened to Jaden Short last year and why he was so average. I know people say that Daniel Rioli and Liam Baker were there taking a lot off him. Last year, he was still the number one kick intaker at Richmond by a fair bit, so we can't really say that Rioli and Baker were stealing his kick-ins. I do see an argument where you could say that they took his disposals and it kind of his rebound 50 distribution away to him. But to what extent, and is that enough without those guys in the team to think that Jaden Short will bounce back, or is he just not as good as he was those 4 years?
Yeah, it was a pretty big drop-off. And the Rioli and Baker stuff is like a very easy way to look at it and go, we're looking at a player that can rebound just because there's other players not there to take what he did. Interestingly enough, like we're looking at what could change with his role. And we can say, okay, well, we want him to be the main distributor. We don't want Rioli to be taking all his points like he was last year, so he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. And also we're expecting the ball to be down in D50 a lot. I guess the main thing that I looked at first was like, what was he doing from kick-ins last year, which he had a lot of because Richmond was still struggling last year. So, like, from that point of view, you could say, well, where's he going to get his growth? He already had the kick-ins last year. In terms of fantasy, a quarter of his points came from kick-ins and getting it up the ground for like kick-in, like handball round the side, everything like that. So that's a quarter of his points already, which is like up there with a lot of the other players for normal kick-in takers. It's not like he's doing good stuff from kick-ins. So it's not going to come from that. And I guess, I'd like to know where you sit on him overall, just from starting him, what you think he can average.
Well, yeah, I don't normally like picking players that essentially have the same role as last year and then just expecting improvement just because some guys are out of their team. But the Richmond example does seem pretty extreme in that they lost 6 of their best premiership players. And Mitch Casey's made this point on a couple of podcasts that they're replacing them with 6 18-year-old kids essentially. So are they going to have to use guys like Short and Vlosten a lot more? Are they going to chip the ball around and try and limit the damage, actually change their game style? Like the knock-on at all cost dimmer game style worked when they had elite talent in there. But if it's just a bunch of teenagers running around, they're going to get chewed up like they were last year. So I would like to see what their actual game plan is going to be this year, and we might not get to see that early enough to make a call. I'm not sure yet. At the moment, quite interested in Short. I am interested in starting him because I do think he could bounce back to like a 90 or a 95, but it's probably more out of hope than actually any real data or stats or intuition at the moment. So I'm kind of conflicted. I do like that he doesn't have the first mid-season bye. Like, I think his mid-season bye is all right, so he's not one of those guys on the round 12 bye, which we have a million of, it seems like. So maybe he could just be a stepping stone placeholder, and then when, like, say, a Sheasel or a Bailey Dale or someone like that comes off their round 12 bye, Short could become them. That's how I'd view them. I'd definitely not viewing him as a keeper by any stretch. For me, he'd be a stepping stone. Hope he can average 95, hope he can make 80k and not have a rookie on field would be my use of him. But I'm also skeptical if he can even do that, because I don't know why his drop-off was so poor last year.
Yeah, like looking through where it came from, it seemed like I would have thought like it'd be like a kick-ins thing, which we have confirmed it not to be. I guess looking at where he was scoring his points, about half of it came from actually getting up the ground and like helping out around the stoppage. So you think of players like Nick Newman who get up as like the kind of sweeper role and then get involved at a stoppage point of view. Like, he dropped off a bit there. He dropped off a bit in his transition stuff as well. Like, for example, his tackling last year, from a stop, like getting up stoppage point of view, like he averaged, in 2023, he was doing like 5 points a game from tackles. And then last year that was down to 2.4. His ground ball stuff, he was doing 9 points from that, which is quite surprising in 2023. And then that was down to 6. So it's actually also getting up the ground and being freed up to do that. So to be honest, maybe that is a Richmond thing. Like, they're not really getting the ball in advantageous situations, and Short is really stuck to be like always kicking out of the back line. Like, his kicks, like short kicks went up last year, 5 extra points per game, which is quite surprising. So he had some good short kicks. His long kicks went down though. So I think it was just a case of Richmond really struggling, him not being able to get up the ground and like actually be attacking as well. Which is quite interesting because, I would have thought it would have just been something simple, like he's just not getting as much ball. But it's more about where he's also getting the ball as well.
Yeah, so after our chat then, what have you got any further thoughts on Short? Like, would you be interested in starting him, or do you think it's a bit of a trap where he'll just do the same thing as last year?
I've got him at the moment just from like initially filling out my team, and I think the main thing that I was like wanting to tick off was, so Rioli's gone, Baker's gone, and a key part of SuperCoach is if the ball's in D50 and you're doing stuff in D50, you're going to get the 20% boost. And I don't know if the ball's going to leave. So he could just be there absolutely farming the whole day in D50. He could score pretty well, and he's got long kicks, so they're always going to be effective if you just kick it long. Yeah. And hopefully the tools down the line, which they did not have last year, hopefully they can make a contest out of it, so then Short doesn't lose points for it. But I just put him in just because of that D50 boost. I think maybe that's too simple, and I've learnt some good things today.
Well, yeah, I've also had him in my preseason team all year and have been fairly keen on him. Maybe not huging out, but yeah, I think we've both made ourselves question a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see what we end up doing, and B, if we hear anything out of Richmond. If they say that they're going to, junk it up a bit more and be more contested and chip it around a lot more and try and play keepings off like someone like St Kilda or West Coast have had to do at times, then I'd be very, very interested. If they're still going to try and go the knock-on dimmer, kick it off the ground and get it forward at all times, I don't think that'll work with their teenagers for one thing, but also it'll hurt Jaden Short, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So it's quite surprising to see that he isn't completely reliant on, chipping it around in the back line, which like all the good halfbacks do, and I would expect that's what he would have done in years gone by. But hopefully he can get up the ground a bit and help out, because like in 2022 when he did have a really good year from a scoring point of view, he was doing like 28 points just from like getting it out of the stoppage. So like if he's sitting out the back and Richmond get it out, he's there, or he can tackle, stuff like that, getting up the ground. But if he's trapped in the back line like last year where he only did 13 points from the stoppage situation. So I think that's something to keep in mind, which, it's pretty crazy to me.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's pretty awesome chat about Bont and Jaden Short and the 3,300 rule, regression to the mean. I reckon our viewers have learnt a lot from today, Jaden. If you want to give a little plug about where people can find you on Twitter, what you've got going on with your website, any other projects you've been working on, I feel like you've had a pretty busy pre-season already.
Yeah, definitely. It never really ended. So I'm helping out over at AFL Fantasy with the rebuild of the platform. So that's mainly what I'm up to at the moment. But yeah, you can still check out my website, statsbyjaiden.com.au. I've got SuperCoach stuff on there. So if you want to see all the stats that I've talked about today, where you can see how certain players are scoring their points, where you could go, Bont's scoring 12 points from 1%ers per game. I've got that up there, and you can go back all the last 4 years and have a look through. So yeah, you can check that out. And yeah, I'm mostly active over on Twitter. You can search my name and it should come up. So yeah, thanks for having me on, Pig. And I hope the viewers learn a lot. I love talking about this stuff because, yeah, it helps me to learn about the game. But also there's just so many things that we can look at from a numbers point of view that we don't normally get to hear about.
Yeah, no, it's just another level of insight that a lot of people don't go to or don't have the skills to go to. So that's always appreciated. The other thing to mention is the SuperCoach Swordplay Season Guide. I've had an input into that. I know you've had an input into doing some things for that as well. So you can go and get that at the SuperCoach Swordplay website. You can use my code to get 10% off, PIG DRSC10. Jaden's got a code to get 10% off. I don't know if he knows it off the top of his head. I'll put him on the spot.
Yeah, it's stats10. So if you want 10% off, you can hit that up.
You can go use either of them, whichever one. Neither of us really care which one you use, but head over to SuperCoach Swordplay and use either of those codes. Get you 10% off. Until then, I'll see you guys next time on the next episode. Don't forget to subscribe, turn the notifications on. We're now halfway through my pre-season series, done 5, got another 5 to go. Really looking forward to the rest of them, and thanks so much for your time, Jaden. It was a really good chat.
Cheers, mate.